Hi, I'm Corbin Fry. Welcome to BTV's World War II documentary, World War II, A Time for Heroes. Throughout the years of 1939 and 1945, the world was engulfed with the greatest war man has ever seen. We now know it as World War II. Throughout the war, many lives were lost and heroes made. This documentary tells their stories.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. I ask that the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
When Japan surprised America with the attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States was drawn into the worldwide conflict, which would later be known as World War II. After a spirited speech by President Roosevelt, the United States declared war on the Axis powers, and all of America united to help the war effort.
This thing has been building up for a long time. A lot of people, you know, when they, especially Americans, when you ask them when World War II started, well, it started December 7th, 1941. Well, that isn't right. A lot of others say it started the 1st of September 1939 when Hitler bombed Poland. That's not quite right either. When it really started was in the summer of 1937 when Japan attacked China. And Japan and China were fighting for 4 years before they ever hit Pearl Harbor.
The Germans started wanting to expand their territory. They went to conquer, they were going to conquer Poland, and evidently they had plans on England and Russia also. They were going to occupy Europe. They was going to control Europe, is what I think they had in mind.
We were, in this country, quite aware of Hitler's existence and his ambitions and his record. And so it was almost, you might say, most of the people, not only that, but he was sending his submarines close off the Atlantic coast of the United States, so that a lot of people that had yachts, wealthy people in the north who wanted to go toward Florida and all like that, they stayed at home. So it was, and of course, they saw what he was up to, and they knew that we were endangered, and that's why our government did make preparations earlier.
Well, I'm not really well versed in that area, but we tended to be isolationists before the war, back in the 30s. Whatever was happening in the rest of the world, let it happen. We don't want to be involved. But as a result of the war, when Germany took all of Europe, France, Netherlands, and the other countries, and they'd gone into Poland and Czechoslovakia, all these other countries, and the Italians with their fascist movement, who were allies of the Nazis, had Italy and part of North Africa. And England was threatened and nearly fell to the bombardments from the air. The Luftwaffe, Hermann Goering, the head of the German Air Force, convinced Hitler that he could bomb England into submission. Well, that didn't work. But they were under extreme pressure. And we were providing support, Liberty ships taking materials to England to help fight the Germans, fight off the Germans, and the expected invasion of England by the Germans.
We didn't have anything against us at first. until they hit Pearl Harbor. After they hit Pearl Harbor, they woke up the sleeping giant, and that's when we had to take control of the war and get involved to protect our interests and keep them from coming into the United States.
Well, it took us long, really, that long to get ready to join the Army, join the fight, really, because we had a real small Army and very low equipment to fight with. So that 2 years that we waited to get into the war gave us time to build up our Army and also our war materials.
Well, it was Sunday morning, and I went over to my girlfriend's house somewhere around 11 o'clock, I'd say, and stopped, and I was going to just talk to her. I don't know what I went over there for. But she came running out of the house as fast as she could run, and she says, "Guess what?" She says, "Pearl Harbor was attacked by the Japanese this morning." And I said, "What's that?" "What do you mean?" I said. He said, they bombed Pearl Harbor. And so I said, "Well, I wonder where that's at." Nobody knew where it was at.
I was here at Smithfield. I came out here. I had gone to church in the morning, and then I came to the airport in the afternoon. And it wasn't until I got to the airport did I hear about the bombing of Pearl Harbor. I really didn't even know where Pearl Harbor was at. I mean, it was an unknown place at that time.
I well remember I'd been to a movie on Sunday afternoon of December the 7th, and when I came home, my father said, "We're at war," and everyone was grouped around the radio. And the next morning when I went to school, there was a big change. A lot of the young boys, juniors, many of them were quitting school and going to join the service. And later, a lot of the girls quit school so they could go join them and be married. And it was a very dramatic time. And I have to laugh when I tell this. I remember one girl was going to meet her intended husband in the state of Vermont, and I didn't even know anybody had ever been to Vermont before. But things were starting to happen right away, and people were really behind the troops and anxious to do things that would help.
And there was a stalemate. The Germans didn't have superiority to be able to move on England. And of course, things were happening in the Pacific at the same time. We got involved in the war because of Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor. And Japan, Germany, and Italy were the Axis powers, the three powers trying to take over the world. Japan in the Pacific, Italy and Germany in Europe, Africa, that part of the world. And the only real staunch ally to what was left of the free world was the United States.
The Germans were sinking some of our ships already. We were trying to supply England and France, our allies in Europe, with war material that they desperately needed. And the German submarines were sinking a lot of ships. They were trying to keep supplies from reaching England.
They knew that Japan and Germany were building up, and they were occupying and capturing other countries. So we were decided that we should get prepared in case they would have an attack on us, which later on they did. So then we had to start preparing for it. And we started a draft a year before we entered World War II, getting prepared for it.
I don't think we would have got in war that quick, but we probably would have later on, because it was also hurting the shipping lanes, and it was hurting the mother country, which was England, and England was our mother country, and they was getting a lot of their ships sunk to the bottom of the ocean because of carrying supplies. And so that would have caused us to get into war sooner or later anyway.
What I was on was the same set that was mobile, that they intercepted those planes at Pearl Harbor, or didn't intercept the planes, they did view the planes, what's the right word? They monitored the planes as they were coming in. And the people on the set was trying to get everybody in action. But the officer said there was a flight of B-24s coming from the States at the same time, and they thought, oh, that's just B-24s, forget it. Well, if you've ever seen Tora, 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 have you seen that? Well, you know what the results was on it. It's very difficult. They lost a lot of planes, a lot of ships, and 1,400 men on one ship. That was it was at Arizona, I believe. And it's still to this day is a monument out in the harbor of Pearl Harbor.
Some Japanese admiral said, I think a long time ago, he says, I'm afraid we have awakened a sleeping dragon, meaning the United States. Now they got us mad, now we're going to go out and kick some butt, so to speak. I think that's the vernacular that the kids use nowadays and understand, and that's what happened. We finally got it all together. We got our, we stopped building automobiles and started making tanks and other military vehicles, artillery pieces and so on, airplanes, and got involved in a heavy way to start providing support to the world with these materials and with our use of these materials. So in that way, many things changed. We lost our isolationist attitude pretty fast. We were involved. There was no getting around it. If we weren't involved, the rest of the world would fall to the Axis powers, and that wasn't going to happen. We weren't going to allow it to happen.
When you're attacked, you naturally have to defend yourself, whether you're an individual or a country.
We wasn't deserving or wasn't ready or didn't need anything like that at that time, but I think the higher officials knew it was coming. It was just a matter of time. The Japanese was very intelligent in that they had the attack on a Sunday morning, when most of the sailors would have been on liberty the night before and weren't in any shape to do very much on Sunday morning. It was a terrible attack, probably one of the most disastrous attacks we've ever had in this country. Compares, of course, with the big attack they had on the buildings in New York City.
It had been going on, all kinds of things. We had shut off our oil shipments to them. Back in those days, we exported oil. So we imposed sanctions upon them, which deprived them of shipments of oil. This put them in a pretty desperate state because you can't run a Navy, for example, Army or Air Corps or anything else without a lot of oil. So things were tense, and we were aware of that. Of course, there was a lot more activity in Europe than there was in our part of the world. But even then, we realized that the world was getting smaller.
I'd made enough rank to where I could apply for my wife to go to Hawaii, and I applied. She got the approval, and she arrived in Pearl on November the 19th, 1941. So she was there about 2 weeks before the attack, 3 weeks before the attack. We had an apartment in Honolulu, and when the first attack started from the Japanese on December the 7th, I was in Honolulu with her, and was immediately directed to go back to my ship. So I went back to the Sacramento. I had this arm broken at the time, and immediately went back to my ship. And I got there for the second attack, which was would have been about 9 o'clock when the second attack came.
I had spent that night with a married couple there who lived on the base, and we had been downtown the night before, and we were up quite late, so I heard this going on. I heard the firing. I thought it was some maneuvers, because as we left the base the previous afternoon to go downtown, we saw an anti-aircraft artillery group moving in and setting up shop on the base. We had been in a high state of alert for several months.
At that time, my skipper told me, he said, I can't take you at sea at the way in the situation, so I'm going to transfer you to the hospital. So during the second attack, I was trying to get from my ship to the hospital, which is a quarter of a mile, walking down along docks alongside the ships. And when the second attack started, I found me a place to hide. I got in the a big net depot there and stayed and got me a place where I thought I'd be safe and stayed out of the way. After the attack was over, I went ahead then to the hospital, not knowing where I was going, anything, and they immediately put me to work as a corpsman. And of course, at that time, with all the injuries and deaths and all, they need all the corpsmen they could get.
And then I heard this wife of the guy with whom I was spending the night. I heard her talking pretty excitedly and so forth. And finally, Bill stuck his head in my room and said, "What kind of insignia do the Japanese planes have on them?" I said, "Well, they got this rising sun on the wings and on the fuselage where we have the stars." He said, "You better get up, David, because they're here." So we ran out in the yards in our underwear to look around, and at this time, the first wave was just leaving. So it had been going on for close to an hour, I guess. And they were flying formation right over Pearl Harbor at a pretty high altitude. And the Americans had their anti-aircraft going all out. You could see the explosions in the sky. They were a good 1,000 feet or so below where the aircraft were, but they were still firing. So we took a quick look at that and went inside and got dressed. I was a little bit concerned because I was in civilian clothes. And I thought I'd better get to a uniform real quick. So Mildred had a bicycle that she used right around the base. And I took that bicycle to ride up to our barracks where I could get dressed.
We lost most of our battleships that day. And they were in what we call Battleship Row, anchored to Ford Island, which is the island right in the middle of Pearl Harbor. And of course, the Japanese, in order to sink them, they came right down. There was a big bay, and they came right down over that area. And all they had to do was just drop their torpedoes in the water, and they couldn't miss because the battleships were tied up and were just in a big long row.
Planes were coming in from the south end of the base, and you could see the explosions hitting the ground, you know. That guy was coming right after me, and I saw the holes in the ground coming up, and then there was one in front of me, and then it jumped over my head. So I felt something about like a bee sting. I didn't know what it was, but I wasn't worried about it. Pretty soon they lit up, and we went on over to the headquarters. We were issued a World War I type helmet. We were issued a .45 caliber pistol, and we also had a gas mask. And we were told that we were at war. So when I got over there, this piece of shrapnel had gone through my shoulder, and my shirt was bloody from this hole up here down to where the pocket came up. The pocket, of course, you know, was well, just like this. It was not a part of the basic part of the shirt, but the visible blood stopped there. It was in behind the pocket.
Many of the buildings and all were, Hickam Field was hit probably the worst of any place around Pearl. And of course, Hickam Field was one of the big air bases there. Ford Island, it was pretty well destroyed, and it was mostly PBYs, small seagoing planes. My ship was not hit. It was tied up between, you know, piers sticking out like this. It was tied up between two piers and was pretty well protected. The ship on the outside, the Ogallala, took two bombs on one side of the ship. And of course, when that does, that floods the compartments. She was rolled over right there at the dock.
And the fact is that even as short a time as 6 months after that attack, this attack was the 7th of December, 1941. The Battle of Midway occurred in early June, June 6, 1942. That's 6 months away. We whipped Japan's Navy at Midway in an epic battle, which was that soon. It was the key battle that turned the tide in the Pacific War. We sank 4 of their aircraft carriers. They sank 1 of ours. And the one that they sank, the Japs thought they had sunk at Coral Sea about 2 months earlier, and they couldn't understand how we got back there. So this poor battleship died, aircraft carrier died twice, as it were. But that didn't really hurt us. It hurt Japan. Japan could not build a new aircraft carrier like we could if they lost one. If we lost one, we'd build 3 or 4 new ones.
Well, there was a man that had a striped hat and stars on his coat and so forth that had a finger pointed at all the young men of that day, said, "I need you." And I went in the Army because I was drafted for service in World War II.
Well, we were involved in World War II as a result of the Japanese attack at Pearl Harbor. And at that time, I was a student at Butler University in Indianapolis. And so all of us of my generation looked around at service options that were available to us. Since I felt it would be nicer to have a bed at night, I enlisted in the Navy Reserve Officer Training Program, and later was called to active duty on July 1, 1943.
Well, I had started flying right here at Smith Field in 1940, and I had a license, and when the opportunity came along, I got the telegram saying my services was needed in I took advantage of it.
I'd never been south before, so we got down here to Louisville, and I went by myself, had my special orders, which I was feeling pretty good about, and the rest of them went somewhere else, and I went on down to Biloxi. Well, a reservation had been made for me on the sleeper, on the Pullman. So I walked up in the station, walked up to the window in the front. What time is my train coming in? I'm feeling pretty good, you know, I'm going to be a cadet. So I walked around in the front of the station, and some black man came up to me and said, "Soldier, what you trying to do, get your head beat?" I said, "No, what do you mean?" He said, "You better come back here with the rest of us black folks." That station, you weren't allowed to get in one part of the depot. You had to go to a separate window to get your ticket. You couldn't drink at the drinking fountain. And so I went back there, then the train came, and I got on, and I said, "I'm looking for, for my berth." And the conductor said, "It's on up there." I said, "Well, here's the reservations." He said, "It's on up there, soldier." So I kept walking and walking, and finally I got up there in the segregated car right next to the engine. The United States was preparing for war before war broke out. And they had, to do that, they had established a selective service, a draft. And I was, for young unmarried men, I was one of them. I was also an elementary school principal. And I was subject to being drafted at any time for 1 year of service. I wanted that 1 year of service to correspond with my school year. So I volunteered in June 1941 to go into the service and get my 1 year out of the way and come back and take my job back, which had been held for me. I didn't get back. December the 7th, 41, you know what happened.
Well, in some ways I didn't have a choice. Back in the 40s, when you turned 18, you had to register for the draft. And you had a choice of either going to the Navy or the Army or the Air Force. And I didn't want to go to the Army, so I enlisted into the Navy before I got drafted into the Army.
He went to a number of special schools. That's where Army brats get their name. We follow them around to different schools. But after the call-up, he went to Europe, to England, where they staged for the invasion.
Well, I was, at the day of Pearl Harbor, I was 16 years old. And I was thinking, when Pearl Harbor was bombed, the following month in January, I would have been 17, I was thinking about the Navy. But I got a little scared about trying to join the Navy because I said, well, gee, I can't swim. I never learned how to swim. And somebody pushed me in when I was small, and it scared the heck out of me, so I never wanted to learn how to go in the water. If I went in the water, I went in very little bit, you know, I never went in too far. So anyway, I waited till I was 18, and I had to sign up for my draft, which I did, and they called me down about 3-4 days later, and I went through a physical, and they said, you're 1A. And on March 17th, I paraded down to Grand Central Station in New York, and they passed me, and I got called. I got a week off. I went in the 24th of March, and I went down to Camp Gordon, Georgia, and that's where I took my basic training. From there, we went on Tennessee maneuvers, and from there, we got shipped out to the Mojave Desert, and we were practicing for Africa. We were out in the desert there, and I'm trying to think of the place. Camp Power and Harbors was what they had. And we started training there for Africa. But then the war ended over in Africa. So they loaded us up on trains, brought us back all through New York, went through Grand Central Station, and we went up to Massachusetts. The town there is called Taunton, Massachusetts. And from there, we left to go overseas.
I went home and talked to my buddy about it, and he said, let's go down and sign up for Marine Corps. I said, well, okay. So we went home, and then a couple of days later, I was trying to figure out how I was going to tell my parents that I wanted to sign up for Marine Corps. So I said, well, I don't know, I was out cleaning out the cow stable. I said, finally, I said, Dad, you realize I might want to join the Marine Corps? Well, he kind of wilted right there. He said, I knew this was coming. Let's go talk to your mother. And we went to talk to my mother. Then they took me down to Evansville at the recruiting office next day or so. And my friend that was going to go with me, for some reason or other, he didn't go. I don't know why anymore. But anyhow, I signed up I went down to the recruit office, and I walked in there. They had a requirement of the height of a Marine. I think it was 5'7". Yeah, 5'7". Well, I looked down and said, I'll never make it. I'm only 5'2", I believe it was. No, 5'6". I was 5'6". And he said, I walked in there, I said, well, sir, I'm only 5'6", but he said, you'll be all right, come on in. Well, they were signing up by the thousands. They really was all over. I'll never forget that. People all over were signing up for the Marine Corps and the Army and everything, too. And so I went down to the recruiting office there, and they gave me a physical for a short term, just a short term, so make sure I could it is not a real physical. But they said, okay, now go home. He said, we got so many people, we can't handle everybody now. Go home and we'll send you a letter through the mail. They didn't have telephone much at that time. And we'll give you a notification when you come. So I went home, and I sat and waited, and every day I ran out the mailbox and tried to get it. And it took about 6 weeks before they finally got enough opening for me to get in. So then my parents took me down to the recruiting office again, and they gave me another short test, put me on a train up to Louisville. Now, how far do you want me to go with this introduction?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. And up in Louisville, they gave me the final physical, and I never saw my parents for 3.5 years after that.
Apparently I was going to be drafted if I didn't do something pretty soon, and I enlisted in the Navy in September the 17th, 1940 in Indianapolis, and was stationed in Indianapolis on recruiting duty for a short period of time. And then, of course, they had 3 divisions of Navy personnel in Indianapolis. They shipped them out about November of 1945, and I requested a transfer to go with them and received the transfer. And we went to Michigan City, Indiana, and picked up an old river gunboat, the USS Sacramento, the PG-19. Didn't have much armament on it, but just at that time it was a training vessel for naval reservists. We took that ship out through the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence Seaway to Boston. Spent the winter of 40-41 in Boston, and was reassigned our home port to Pearl Harbor, Territory of Hawaii. And we left Boston on, I'd say, April or May headed towards Pearl Harbor. Of course, we had to go down the East Coast, stopped in New York, Norfolk, Guantanamo Bay, Cristobal, that's one side of the Panama Canal, and Panama City, and then up to San Diego, and ahead to Pearl. Arrived in Pearl about September of 1941. And we was on duty there and assigned to various small trips and so forth. Of course, we wasn't at war at that time with anything out there.
When I was in University of Wisconsin, and in 1941, I was a member of the 1941 NCAA championship team in Wisconsin. We beat Indiana, incidentally. But anyway, I was in Wisconsin, going to school, and the war started. And I was in physical education. I wanted to be a coach at the time, but I decided that a little later on I was going to change into recreation and physical therapy. And I was getting some physical therapy training, and I was going to, in the Army, to a veterans hospital. You know where they are, in a veterans hospital. And I happened to have to give a physical exam. And I want to enter, because at that time, everybody wanted to go into war effort. It's not like the other wars that we've had. This was concerned. We thought the Germans were going to come over to our own country, and we had to turn the lights down in the East Coast. It was very dramatic. It was a war effort that everybody was involved in, everybody was concerned with. So I thought, well, I got to do that. So I was going to go as a physical therapist, and I had to take a physical exam, and questions an exam, you know, if you've ever had measles and all of this stuff. And I said, well, I broke my bone, and I dislocated my shoulder playing basketball 4 or 5 times, and I had a broken collarbone in football. And I a little later got your 4F. You can't go in. So we didn't have computers. They couldn't follow that exam. So I went to Milwaukee 2 days later into an Air Corps recruiting office, and I went through and took the whole thing, and they asked about the physical, and I never told them a thing. I'm just fine. And I got as a cadet at the time. And I had never flown a plane in my life. And I was a college student. I'd been 2 years in school, and all at once I had to leave my sophomore year at the end of that year to go in the Air Corps.
At that age, and some of you are getting that age now, I was eager for action. I wanted to get where it was, you know. So I knew that the National Guard was going to be conscripted into federal service. So I figured that's the best thing to get into there, because it was supposed to only last a year. And they have a song that came out at that time, "Goodbye dear, I'll be back in a year," which was a big lie because I got back 5 years later. But I got in the National Guard so that I could get in the Army and see some action.
I certainly do. I was 2.5 when it happened, but my dad was on active duty at Mississippi at Camp Shelby, and we had gone away for the weekend to Gulfport, Mississippi. When the war broke out, they announced over the radio, all soldiers return to your base immediately. The United States may be under attack. And I think my dad thought he was Parnelli Jones or A.J. Foyt or something. We got back in real short time, so pretty indelibly etched in my memory, that ride back to camp.
Well, I volunteered originally when I was living in Chicago, hopefully to get a commission. But I couldn't pass the physical up there, and they said maybe if they send my application to Washington, they'll approve me over the failure to pass the physical. So my wife and I and baby came back to Indianapolis, where our home originally was, and at that time, if you were called, if your application was accepted, you had 48 hours to report to duty. So that's why we came back to Indianapolis. Then after I'd been in Indianapolis for some time, I got word that I had been turned down, period, that I was not fit for sea duty. So then I waited, and when my number came up, I went down and they assigned me to the Navy, and I was fit for sea duty as an enlisted man, but not as an officer, a distinction I failed to understand. and ultimately was assigned to a destroyer escort.
I went to the University of Illinois for undergraduate work because I lived closer to Illinois University than Indiana. And then I went to graduate school at Ann Arbor, University of Michigan. And I went back to Illinois University to do postdoctoral work. And I worked on natural products there, things like alkaloids and medicinals, that sort of thing, that are extracted from plants and animals. And then I got my first job offer at the University of Pennsylvania. That's right in the middle of Philadelphia. And I started there in the fall of 1941.
I enlisted in January of 1941. I wanted to go to machinist school, and that was offered at Chanute Field. And when I enlisted, the post was closed, so I didn't get to go to Chanute. They sent me to Jefferson Barracks outside of St. Louis, and I was there until May of 1941. While we were there, we lived in what they called Tent City, and it was in the valley, and we had stoves in our tent. As I remember, there was about 6 men in a tent, and there was stoves in our tent, and somebody came around at nighttime, kept the fires burning. And in the morning when we'd get up, we would blow black stuff out of our nose, and it was just a low cloud of black over our tent area.
I was working in downtown Chicago in a bank when this program was started. Miss Lucille Petrie was the head of it, and President Roosevelt felt that a lot of our professional nurses were joining the service to go overseas and that our hospitals were going to be short. So they started this program to recruit young women at that time, mostly women, to become student nurses and staff the civilian hospitals. And so I joined the fall that it started and went into nurses training at Michael Reese Hospital in Chicago for a 3-year nursing program, and our only obligation was to remain in some kind of nursing until the end of the war. And it so happened that the war ended before we finished our nurses training.
Well, when we went to Sweetwater, Texas, there had been male pilots there being trained. Our training was just exactly the same as theirs. They did unusual attitudes, they did whatever needed to be done. Our physical setups and things was the same as the military. Now, we went through training in 6 months, where the fellas went, it takes about 9 months to train a pilot. But this was because I had a license before the war. I started flying in 1940.
I was drafted in 1942 because back then, whenever you was that age and they was fighting a war, you were drafted. You had to go. And of course then they wanted fighters, and the biggest part of them went to the infantry. And that's where I ended up in Camp Phillips, Kansas, training endlessly. So that involved a lot of Boy Scout living out in the woods, so to speak, but we were on battle zones, homemade battle zones, you know. And we went to the Tennessee maneuvers back then. When they got the divisions ready, they taught them in the mountains how they was going to be fighting in the mountains over in France and Germany. So that's really where I got my training, and also in Camp McCain, Mississippi.
I was 18 and a half, 6 months out of high school. And I joined up in November of 42 and was called to duty in January of 43. And then went on to flight school, which lasted about a year.
No, I was drafted.
In what year were you drafted?
I was drafted May the 19th, 1943.
And what did you do after being drafted?
Well, we went to, from Spencer Armory, a busload of us went to Indianapolis Armory and took our physical, in which we were in there all day long, in there naked all day long. And the people that didn't pass, why, they put them on the upper on the second floor. In fact, I think there were only about 6 out of 30-some people, you know, that passed. And then we were sent back home for 7 days vacation or furlough, whatever you want to call it, to get your problems all straightened out and this and that. And then back the 26th for your induction to Fort Benjamin Harrison.
I had been in nurses training, and I went into nurse training in 1939. And of course, you know, Pearl Harbor came along, and I was still in training at the time of Pearl Harbor, and of course was very interested in what was going on. And I graduated from nurses training in 1942. And I was raised in South Dakota, and I took my nurses training there. So I went to work in Brookings, South Dakota, which was not very far from where I live, and thought I wanted to go into the service at that point, but I figured it was better for me to have a little bit of work outside of nurses training to have a little experience. So I decided that I'd go to Brookings, South Dakota to work before I went into the service. So as it happened, I went to Brookings and started working in this small hospital. We didn't have interns or residents or anything, so you were everything, so you got a lot of experience there. But as I was there, the Army personnel came to get their training at the college there. There was no hospital for the Army personnel, so we took care of all the Army personnel at that point. And so they were in our hospital, those, and of course they were not battlefield type of thing, but we took care of the Army personnel. And then I decided to go into the service in 1944. So I volunteered and I went to take my basic training.
I registered for the draft on October 15th, 1940. And I was a student at IU. Everybody at that time had to register for the draft. We didn't know when we were going to get called. We had a certain number appointed to us. And as our number was drawn out, that's when we got drafted. We didn't know when, but I kept hanging on. So in 1943, in the summer, I got my draft notice. I'd already been married. I had about a year-old daughter. And when I left for the draft, my daughter was 1 year old on that same day I left, as in 1943. I reported to Indianapolis, to the recruiting station, and I thought I was going into the Army, you know, but some big highfalutin guy in the Navy started talking to some of us, and when he talked to me, he said, you'll be better off going into the Navy. And I asked him why. He said, oh, you already know all the things that you learn in the Army. He says, you can put all that to work in the Navy. So before I got through there, why, he had talked me into volunteering for the Navy. At that time, you could go into the Navy for 4 years, or since I was drafted, they let me volunteer, and they called me then a selective volunteer because I had been selected for the draft. So I got in for the 2 years plus the duration of the war. And I was in there at that time till I got out. I was in there 2 years, 2 months, and 20 days. But I counted every day. And I got out a lot earlier than the 4 years I would have had to serve if I'd gone into the other program.
I was drafted.
And what year was that?
That was, I signed up in 1941, but I didn't go to service till 1944 in May of 1944. And basic training, and went overseas, and our troop ship landed in France in December the 9th, 1944. And I was captured a prisoner of war January the 9th, 1945. So I was only over there a month till I was a prisoner.
It was regimented. That means everything was scheduled. You were told when you were going to do what. And you had very little free time. And it was vigorous, it was active, with plenty of physical training like marches and bodybuilding and calisthenics and all that.
I was drafted.
Okay. What age were you?
I was, well, when I went in, I was 18. But when I made the invasion over there, I was 19.
Well, I was in the Army, but I was attached to a unit in the 5th Air Force in the Asia Pacific theater. I was the group I was with was a light bomb group, A-20s, and we stayed with them the whole time we were there in the Pacific after we joined them. The outfit that I was with was called the 895th Chemical Company, and we made napalm bombs to load onto the airplanes, which they dropped on enemy emplacements.
Well, at that time, nearly everybody was subject to the draft, or they volunteered. And everybody was very enthusiastic about going into the war. And it was just a thing to do at that time.
I went to mechanic school at Chinook Field, but then I was sent to St. Louis, Missouri, where I took 2 weeks training on Sperry power turrets. And then I was sent out west to a bomb group where I joined the armament section. So I had to learn machine guns and bomb racks and ammunition and so forth.
I was 17 when I volunteered, and graduated from 7th school, and just about the time I was 18. I went to, like I say, I went to the machinist mate school up at Great Lakes and Ford Motor School. Went to the machinist mate school up there, like I said, and then went up to New London to go through submarine school, and I graduated up there sometime around September the 15th. My birthday was September the 5th, I was 18.
We didn't have to do a lot of the marching and physical training, such as on the firing or on the firing range and stuff like that, because we were in the medical detachment. We were not allowed to carry any firearms of any kind, and so they give us classes. The 2 captains that were in charge of us, well, they give us a certain amount of training and the bones in the body and how to take care of them if they were unconscious, and do bandages on certain parts of the body and whatnot. So it was interesting, but to me it was very interesting.
And I went in 42, and I went to Florida for a little close order drill named Sandlot. And went to Keesler, AM school at Keesler Field. You boys know what AM school is? Airplane Mechanics School, Keesler. And I went to advanced school in Burbank, California on the 17th. And then they sent us to gunnery school at Las Vegas. And then they sent us to Salt Lake City. From Salt Lake City on down to Powell, Texas. That's where they made the crews up, put you in your position, and so on.
Well, I was eventually drafted. I tried to enlist, but I was a little bit underweight. I had rheumatic fever 5 times before I entered the Army Air Corps. I tried to enlist, but I was underweight by 5 pounds, so I was eventually drafted.
There's a railroad track. And when you cross the railroad track, you get in the white section, which we didn't know. So we was walking along and we passed some soldiers and they spit behind us. We had to run, get back on the other side of the railroad track. But what you know, you are acclimatized to what you know, and it feels natural. And when we got there, they didn't have any room in the barracks. We slept in tents. And once we had a big rain and all of our stuff floating in water, but there was no room in the barracks. And we on one side of the base. We weren't allowed to go into the white PX. And we had a black theater. We had to go to that. But we used to see those P-40s, man, and this thing, you know, our time's coming. So we went from there, called a college training detachment. That was on campus to give those of us who didn't have a college education equivalent to 2 years in about 5 months, an accelerated education.
I was in the 87th Division, attached to the 3rd Army when we went in combat. I was a radio operator and truck driver in the headquarters battery of the 335th Field Artillery Battalion. We had 12 guns, 155 howitzers. We were responsible for supporting the infantry, and that was the main thrust of it. We worked with forward observers. It was working with the infantry up front, and we worked with spotter planes that would spot targets, give us the coordinates, and then we'd fire on whatever was holding up the infantry.
Well, we went to England, and we knew that we were going to war, so they postponed it, I think, 2 or 3 days on account of the fog. It was so foggy. But we would, every night, well, we'd go out and get on the boat and we'd practice. And then when the fog lifted, why, we went across there.
In the reserve, we had simulated problems of occupying a country, you might say, and where we had to take charge of the government. And the strategic intelligence, that was what we did was top secret, so I can't tell you.
Flight school was, well, it was a lot of physical training to begin with, you know, making sure you're in shape. And we went through ground school, which prepared us for weather training and meteorology, math, all kinds of preparation so we could handle what was to come, okay? And from ground school, we went into primary flight school that was flying the old biplane BT-13. It was a 2 double wing, two open cockpit trainer is what it was, BT-13. Great airplane to fly. And From there, we went on to what we called the basic flying school. That was a monoplane, single wing, one wing, low wing. It was an enclosed canopy, 2 seats, the instructor up front, always the instructor up front, the student in the back seat. We did a lot of cross-country flying there, and instrument flying, formation flying, just to get, gradually moving up with experience. From basic, we went to advanced flying school. Now here, a decision had to be made whether we were going to go to bomber school, bomber training, bomber pilot training, or fighter pilot training. And we had a choice. We were asked what we wanted to do. And of course, most of us wanted to be fighter pilots. That was supposed to be the exciting part of the war, which it was, turned out anyway. But not everybody was selected fighter pilot. I was one of the fortunate ones, and I got to go to fighter school, which was down in Marianna, Florida. And there we flew the AT-6, another monoplane, enclosed cockpit, again, 2-seaters, the instructor up front and the student in the back. And here we did a lot of maneuvers, a great airplane to fly. It was getting close to a fighter by this time. A lot more horsepower, a lot faster. And we flew ground gunnery, dive bombing, and aerial gunnery, shooting out a sock, which followed another airplane and would come in and follow the sock and shoot at it for scoring. And formation flying, night flying. And on graduating from that school, each one of these schools lasted about 2 months. And graduating, we received our wings, pilot wings, as well as rank, second lieutenant.
I went into the Army immediately after being married, I was married on December the 8th, 1941, to the precious wife that I still live with. Immediately after we were married, I had a call from the draft that said they had called me and they wanted me to come, so I went up for my induction, and because I had a little impairment, a little poor vision in my left eye, they rejected me and sent me back home to my bride, put me in class 1B. Now I thought that being in class B meant that I would be there when they left and be there when they got back. That's what I thought when I went home. But just in a few months, the war worsened greatly, and I was sent a second notice that I was up for draft again. So this time in July, I was drafted into the service. Went to Fort Bliss, Texas in the fall of 1942. Was assigned to an anti-aircraft battalion, 448th Coast Artillery Anti-Aircraft Battalion. And because of lack of non-commissioned officer personnel, almost immediately I was promoted to the rank of corporal as a squad leader in training for the anti-aircraft. During basic training, we took basic infantry training and then began training for anti-aircraft warfare. And almost immediately after we ended basic training, they come out one day and called my name and said, "You are to get your paraphernalia and go up to the airborne unit up on the hill at Fort Bliss, Texas." I was being transferred from the anti-aircraft to an airborne unit to take glider training. Now, you kids don't know what a glider was, but that was a powerless flying machine that was towed behind a plane, and when they got over the enemy territory, they cut the glider loose, and we were to fly in powerless and land wherever we might behind the enemy lines. Now that was quite an experience.
The fact that I learned to pray there. I took glider training, airborne training for 6 weeks. Every week we was taken in for physical examinations to see if we had attained proper weight and so forth, physical condition. At the final inspection after 6 weeks, I was 10 pounds too light for glider service. They said, get your paraphernalia and go back to your old unit. Go back to the 448th Coast Artillery Battalion, and there you will remain.
We took our basic there, part of our basic. But going in there, it was, oh man, it was storming and raining. These were new barracks and these big ditches all along the streets. And that water, you know, was all level. And of course, you know what we done. Walked off in that water. And you got in the barracks and about 3 o'clock in the morning. And then 5 o'clock out, get out, you know, out of bed. You just get in there, get your bed, man, get to sleep. And then all these old cadre were 19, 30, 35, 36 people. And they were down in Pearl Harbor whenever they bombed Pearl Harbor. And man, they were rough.
Anyhow, they sent me to a bosun's mate school. And they sent me to Washington, D.C. I thought, boy, what a great thing to go to Washington, D.C. for 16 weeks of training. Well, we got into Union Station at Washington, D.C. They took us out and we put us on a school bus, and they took us about 60 miles outside of Washington, D.C. to an amphibious training station called Solomon's Island. We were out there 10 weeks without a liberty. That's where we trained for the amphibious part of what we were going to do. We were on a landing craft. We went aboard a training ship. There was 3 of us. There was a bosun's mate, who was me, and there was a gunner's mate who was in charge of all the guns on board, and a machinist who had charge of all the engines on board. So we were the training crew. We trained. Later on, the ship's company that was training us left, and then we took over as ship's company, and we were added to our crew, which was about 12 guys, and we trained another crew, and we just kept passing that ship on to other people, you know, after we got trained. Well, we left and we picked up our ship in New Orleans, and it was already hoisted aboard a LST, which is a lot larger craft than we were. Of course, they hoisted us up and put us on top and lashed us down on top, and this is how we got across the Atlantic Ocean.
Well, basic training, everybody thinks that nurses and women didn't get the training, but you had to do the type of training that not as difficult maybe as, but we had to do push-ups, we had to go under the wire things, and they shoot over you and like crawl, and you had to climb over to be saved on ship, you know, climb the ropes and all that. So then we went out on, they sent us out on what they call find your way back home from maps and so forth, and I went into my basic in Camp Carson, Colorado, so we were out in the mountains, and I was not very good at reading maps in the first place, but they put you out and you were supposed to find your way back and so on.
Well, I went through 6 months of photography training, and then I went through aerial photography in B-17s, and then I went through aerial gunnery and B-24s. I went through, I was assigned to do aerial photography gunnery and a B-29, and the two 2 weeks later, the atomic bombs were dropped, and so I was sent to Japan for the Army of Occupation, and that's how I ended up doing the aerial photography of Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
I had never even flown in an airplane. And so I was sent to Winthrop College. It was a girls' school. It was out in North Carolina. And it was about 1,100 girls, and we had 300 cadets there. And we were supposed to get basic training because a lot of the people going in were very young. They hadn't got any college education and training. And so they were going, and we were taking basic courses like we got in a freshman in college, for example. And so they found out I had 2 years of college, and 2 years they pulled me out 2 weeks after, and I almost cried because that was kind of a nice place there. 1,100 girls and 300 boys. We couldn't be in the street with them, but we could see them and smile with them, and were invited out to dinner. And so I went to Nashville, and so I went through all the battery of tests, 2 days of tests. And all at once after the test, it just came out, here's a list of all the people here, and my name was on a twin-engine plane pilot. Some of them were navigators, some of them were bombardiers. You know, they got different things. So all at once, I was a pilot. I didn't know what I was going to be. At Winthrop College, I got 10 hours of flying a little Cub airplane. You know, you've seen them out the airport. And I soloed there. So that's my first time I was in an airplane. It was exciting. I didn't know any, but when you're younger then, everything's exciting now.
Well, it was mostly lectures, and then we were assigned to the floors, and we would rotate from the medical to the surgical to the pediatric to the psychiatric and to the communicable diseases, which we don't have very many of those anymore, but we did that. And we had uniforms, and we were issued uniforms and had some privileges, but we weren't really in the military.
1st of May, I went to Chanute Field, and I knew a fella was there. He was from near Auburn, Indiana here, and he seen my name come across his desk, and he seen I had mechanical drawing at Tri-State University in Angola, and he asked me if I wanted to go to the drafting room. I was sure that beat KP altogether a lot. So I worked in there until, I don't remember how much, couple, 3 months I believe it was. Then I went to machinist school at Chanute.
We had a submarine school, and they just give you all kind of deals about what makes a submarine, the buoyancy of a submarine. You know, like yourself, you know what makes a submarine float on top? It's air. See, so you have to have air around the tank. They got a hull, and they got got another hull on the outside of that, and this other hull that's filled full of air. And you let that, when you want to go down, you open the vents up and flood the outside compartments, and down you go. Now you have to be sure you got the right buoyancy for a certain depth. You know, it all depends there. You have to train that, and then you have to train to know how to run lines from one place to the other, because then when it got assigned to a boat, when it's a new construction, as it's being built, you had to know where every line went. And it was the air lines and everything, and the hydraulic lines, and how you could, and which one's the most dangerous, most apt to give trouble, because there's always someone more prone to trouble than the others.
When I was in OCS, which is Officers Training School, we get up 5 o'clock in the morning. We'd have 30 minutes of close order calisthenics. Then we'd go to breakfast. Then we'd have classes all day. And then we would have more classes until about 11 o'clock at night.
Now, we had a couple of West Point students came there, trained with us. And one was named Rivers. But they couldn't get their own training because they were black at West Point. It's like B.O. Davis. B.O. Davis, although he was a West Point graduate, he couldn't go to white flying school, and he wanted to fly, and so they finally got this school, and that's how he came to Tuskegee. Now, his father was a general in the regular army, But he was a West Point graduate. I don't know if you know the story about him or not, but all the time he was at West Point, he had his own room. He was ignored completely. No one even speak to him. And under those unusual circumstances, he prevailed. And it's because of him, Tuskegee Airmen became what they became.
See, the Army has a great many support services, and for every person who was in battle, I think there has to be about 10 people in support services. And one of those support services is field artillery, which goes into battle, of course, and it can be dangerous. So at no choice of mine, the Army, by its process of examining me and selecting me, sent me for basic training in field artillery, which ordinarily would be a cannoneer. But the artillery had their support services, such as they had to have communications, telephone, radio, surveying, and that sort of thing. So when they looked at my test, they saw that I had experience in music, and they thought that correlated with the ability to learn Morse code, and radio used Morse code on the battlefield at that time. So they sent me to a special battery to learn the Morse code, or radio battery.
After about 5 months in the infantry, why, I would do almost anything to get out of the infantry. So I volunteered to go into aviation training. And I went to flying school in Texas, which lasted about 9 months. After I got through flying school, I was sent to a bomber group for further training.
When I got back there, they had finished their training for aircraft, anti-aircraft work, and were ready to be shipped overseas. That meant that since I had not trained with them in anti-aircraft, I was not eligible to go overseas. So I missed that shipment. Almost immediately, I was promoted to the rank of Staff Sergeant and was shipped to Camp Hahn, California as a cadreman. A number of people went to that camp to form officers and non-commissioned officers to train new recruits as they came in to the Army. I spent about 1.5 years in Camp Hahn, California, training new troops in anti-aircraft service. And finally, during at the end of about the latter part of 1944, they decided they had too many anti-aircraft troops, and they decided to send me back to the infantry. I was sent back to Camp Howes, Texas. Took 6 more weeks of infantry training, or several weeks of infantry training. And then in early year of 1945, we were, during the Battle of the Bulge, we were shipped out to Europe.
All the things we did to support the war, saving soap to send in, tin foil, flattening out, taking the paper off the tin cans and stomping those flat to send to the war effort. I have with me today some of the ration books that I was issued for things like sugar and flour and all the other foodstuffs that were rationed during the war. You couldn't just get anything you wanted like we do now. You couldn't just go to the market and load up. You had to have stamps to get certain scarce items.
People who had any yard space at all, because of the shortage of certain foods, were anxious to dig up and plant and preserve whatever they could raise. And they did it gladly.
The food stamps, rubber, and even chewing gum at that time had metal a foil to wrap around it, and we saved even every little bit of that. And there wasn't much traveling done at that time because when I got my telegram to report to Chicago, I couldn't take a car because gas was rationed and the tires were rationed. So I went to Chicago. My first train ride was to Chicago for my interview. And I also went to Sweetwater, Texas for training by train, not by car.
Yes, it was a contract between it was called the National Defense Research Committee, and they had a subgroup on explosives. These are all civilian people headquartered in Washington, and they negotiated a contract. They paid the University of Pennsylvania, and I managed and directed the research under that contract. But I had to write reports every month, and I had to go to meetings with chemists from all over the world, not including Germany, of course. I had to get a monthly report out, and I would meet with people who were in large chemical companies, and for a young new faculty member, that was very heady business. And I had experiences that very few new faculty members would have because I met with people from England, Canada, and the United States.
What we had then, everybody was working together. There wasn't any fighting or putting people down or just, it was a group activity and you were proud to be a part of it. You wanted to help. Everybody wanted to help. We had to do something. I was not in the, I was just in about a year, the last year of the war. Before that, I had worked in a war plant, and we made, they made axles for Timken Detroit Axle, which went to the war front. And I did that for a while, and then I wanted to do something else. So when I got into advertising, I advertised myself into the Corps. So
people were so interested in doing things to be constructive, things to be helpful. And any sacrifice, I mean, we went without butter on the table, without sugar to put in our food and things like that. And these were sacrifices that we made that didn't amount to that much. But I mean, it was something we could do. And we'd go to the store and a lot of things wouldn't be there that we were used to getting. And I know my father had bought a new car, 1939 car, and he debated a long time about buying it, wondering if he could afford it. But he was very glad that he had because he had new tires, and you couldn't buy tires.
Well, we raised money for war bonds. Kids couldn't maybe afford a bond, but they had these little things you could buy for a dime that you know, stamps instead of bonds. And we try to raise money for that to help support the war effort. Got enough stamps, you could buy a bond.
Oh, the newsreels, yes. At the theaters, it would always have this Paramount News, the same music that came on, and the very dramatic voices. And it would be what we're seeing on CNN or some of the stations now, just the details.
So we just tell you about the war, what was going on.
But it was, I don't remember so much criticism, and I like that. I'd like to see us a little bit more supportive of our troops today.
But the civilian population at home during the war who made great contributions, and women worked in industries to support the war, and and people bought war bonds they sacrificed by not being able to have gasoline very much, and other types of rationing. I think maybe once sugar was rationed. I'm not sure.
Okay, I was working in advertising in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and I had service advertising to do, which was so that I'd gotten the news that they really needed medical technicians badly. All the guys coming back from the South Pacific, and they needed somebody right away. They couldn't wait for 6 months or something. So I decided to join and be one of those medical technicians.
Well, there were practically no women working in factories prior to that. And then all of a sudden there were vacancies, and women got the idea, well, I could do that to help out. And then that changed society a lot too.
We did have prisoners of war from Italy and Germany, however, but they were they came to work. The Italians were really nice little guys. I was one of the taller ones next to them, so they were really short. I think they didn't have much food over there, and I liked them. One of them asked me to see the Red Cross and get a pair of shoes for his wife, excuse me. So I did that, but outside of that, the Germans were really, I didn't like to get anywhere near them. They were cold, and our lieutenant told us one day that they thought we were a camp to make more citizens for the government. She said, so pull in your bellies. But anyway, we weren't there for that purpose. So that was kind of interesting.
Oh yeah, we had a victory garden. We lived at 1202 North Woodlawn here in Bloomington. We came back here when the war started because that was our home. And let's see, I was 2.5 when I started, and I was about 6 when it ended. So there was a lot of patriotism. I don't know if you probably know about the stars in the windows of the homes where people were serving. And we had a star in the window for my dad, and he sent a lot of pictures back. I have telegrams that he sent on birthdays and stuff like that. And he brought back a lot of interesting souvenirs.
Gasoline and tires and certain foods. We had stamps, and I know my typing class in high school, we helped type up ration books, and the people would come to the high school and get their ration book where I lived. And then you would tear out one, and when you went to the grocery, I believe coffee, I'm not sure what all we were short of.
Well, the most important one was the explosive known as RDX. Those letters stand for Research Department Compound X. Actually, this explosive was first made right here on Indiana University campus. It was a doctoral dissertation for a man in his graduate work at Indiana University. And he called it cyclonide, and it was an extremely powerful explosive, far more explosive than the explosives that had been used by the military before. And it was obviously very good, but he offered this. He took a job the rest of his life with the military in their research department, and he tried very hard to get them to introduce or to accept RDX and make it an official explosive. And the generals after World War I weren't very interested in research, and they said, well, it's too hard to make, it's too dangerous to handle, and we don't think we need it. And so Dr. Hale, that was his name, Dr. George Hale, published this in a magazine that's distributed all over the world, the Journal of the American Chemical Society. He published all the details, and all over the world, all the military establishments all over the world started doing research with this new explosive. And some of them had terrible explosions doing it. They were often careless. But at any rate, when Hitler began to become very powerful in the 1930s, the English got extremely worried because they had practically no preparation for war either. They were like us, they practically dismantled their military. So they started research, and they picked on this explosive cyclonite that had been made here at Indiana University. And they developed the engineering plant. And that engineering, those plans for a new plant were sent over in a submarine to the United States in a black box when Franklin Delano Roosevelt promised to help the British by giving them 50 old warships. They called us Lend-Lease, and we did in fact transfer the ships. But that wasn't the whole part of the Lend-Lease agreement with England. We also secretly were helping them with research in explosives and defense against poison gas. There was a great deal of worry that the Germans would use poison gas. And you know the Germans did develop a very potent nerve gas, so potent that it would, one drop on your hand would kill a person in a very short time. So there was a lot of concern that we were not prepared and that England was not prepared. And all this information that England had was sent over with some very important people to the United States. And the DuPont company was then hired to build a big factory to make RDX right here in Indiana.
Everybody had to do their bit. I mean, for instance, the filling stations at that time, gas had to be pumped by hand. And women had to go and work at the filling station and pump the gas, put it in cars because there were not enough men to do those jobs.
And a lot of our Hollywood celebrities contributed. Some went and served, and then many went to entertain, and that was helpful too.
Well, there's like between 30 and 60 guys on a board. These fellas had been treated in Hawaii first. So when we got them, they were on the way to recovery. And it wasn't much as bad a job as the people who did the first treatment. So yeah, there were 60 guys on a ward, or 20 or 30, depending on how sick they were. We had to be in the neuropsychiatric ward too. That was kind of bad. We had one guy who kept saying over and over and over, "I'd be alive today if I had just done something or another." You know, mind is gone. We had another kid he was pale as ghost. He lost all his hair. He'd killed his captain, and he didn't mean to. I do this, I'm sorry. But anyway, it affects them. You know, you don't come out of that and just everything's kosher.
We also worked on another explosive to replace nitroglycerin. And at that time, to set off the big guns, the huge guns on battleships, nitroglycerin is used. And you've heard of nitroglycerin. It's a liquid, and it evaporates very slowly. So when you store nitroglycerin, you have to be very careful that it doesn't evaporate and collect in odd places and cause an explosion. And so the Navy wanted to get rid of using a liquid. They wanted to get it solid. So we made some chemicals that were similar in their chemistry, but which were solid and could be packed in solid shells, and which wouldn't evaporate.
People were knitting things to send to the troops, and I remember some auditorium or some gymnasium where I was, and there was a big sign that said, "Remember, Pearl Harder." And pearl is one of the knitting stitches, you know. Instead of Pearl Harbor, it says, remember Pearl Harder. And, but it was the thing to do, and we were all interested in the outcome.
As the war would drag on, Americans would realize that the struggle would be long and the sacrifices great. Heroes would emerge from the battlefields in Europe, to the islands in the Pacific, to the factories in America. It would take a heroic effort to preserve the American way of life.
No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory.